Oh, what is wrong with this chair?
Hello. Oh, you're ready.
Hello.
Excuse us. Okay, we're starting. This is the third panel. Mapping Somaliness and Somali Identity. My name is Ahmed. I am the moderator, discussor. And what I will do is I will briefly introduce our speakers, and then we will have questions and have the time about this. Okay. So first, I will introduce the Shamsa Birik, who's joining us from, I think, Sweden, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Shamsa is a graduate student in political science based at Lund University, Sweden. Her research interests are African security and governance in relation to transnational terrorism, as well as the nexus between gender and violence. Her paper today is titled Accidental Citizens, Etherealizing Securitized Identities of Somalis in Kenya, Contesting Representation, Identity, and Belonging. Okay. Our second speaker is Sharmarke Abdullahi. Sharmarke works for the city of Ottawa as a business consultant with crime prevention, Ottawa, and has also worked as a part-time lecturer at Algonquin College in the social services worker program. Sharmarke holds a BA from Carleton University and a Master of Research in Public Policy from the Queen Mary University of London. Queen Mary University of London, right? And our third speaker is Fowsia Abdulkadir. Fowsia Abdulkadir is a research analyst at the WHO Collaborating Center on Non-Communicable Disease Policy in the Public Health Agency of Canada. Ms. Fowsia is currently a doctoral candidate at the School of Canadian Studies, Carleton University, Ottawa, specializing in political economy and gender and women's studies. Shamsa, we're going to begin with you. So whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready now.
Okay.
So pleased to join you all. I'm terribly sorry I wasn't able to make it, but I'll try to compensate for my absence with my presentation, hopefully. Just to throw a caveat, my paper will sound a bit very ontological and very philosophical. Yeah, just to give you a caveat. My research focused on the nexus of security and identity of Somalis in Kenya. To conceptualize this interrelation of security and identity, I used the Copenhagen School concept of securitization that considers formation of identities in the context of othering. However, I relied on the critical security studies approach in my paper. To elaborate security and identity, I used concepts of belonging, citizenship, and representation as analytical tools to further interpret how Somalis become securitized subjects in Kenya. I also did embrace Laclau and Mouffe's discourse theory on identity formation that considers identity as contingently located and determined by discourse. alongside my paper, can be categorized as a post-colonial critique to essentialized ideas of statehood, national security, and identity. Both security studies and Laclau and Mouf's theories place much emphasis on the political, quote-unquote, that is power, and demanded separation from security, hence why I chose to blend these two. On the other hand, Laclau and Mouf's theory of identity formation, which is primarily theory of is by sorry, is my voice echoing, or is it okay?
You're good.
Okay, sorry. On the other hand, Laclau and Mouf's theory of identity formation, which is primarily a theory of power, is by definition pluralist, decentered and decentralized, with its insistence on difference and its anti-authoritarian, open-ended politics. It makes it very useful for post-colonial work. In my paper, I provide both historical and contemporary trajectories of how the Somali as an image of a threat was created and how the struggle against it continues to be articulated within the security sphere in Kenyan politics. The defiance of Somalis towards being constituted territorially, politically, the nation state marked the beginning of the misrepresentation of the Somali body in Kenya and its associated threat, quote unquote. I theorize an identity and the state, not as state totality, but as a distance that is contained and operating in space. I disqualify the identity of privilege and political correctness, so that the idea of history or knowledge production for minority groups can be positioned and contested. This form of views and partial meanings that can never be fully fixed, thus opening up the terrain for struggle. This epistemological framework allows me the way to locate change from which Somalis in Kenya can challenge the dominant regime that have historically represented them as threats. For the possibility of pluralism to emerge, there should be necessity or permanence of harmonic order. This is because of other aspects.
Shamsa?
Yes?
We're just cutting in and out. I'm wondering if it's the internet connection.
My internet connection?
Yeah, if you're just cutting in and out. So we're catching only bits of what you're saying.
Should I log out?
Back in, sorry. Yeah, do you want to maybe do that, and then are folks okay with us maybe moving to somebody else for now? Just because we're missing every other word, there's no. While we figure this out. Okay. Thanks, Shamsa. Do you mind logging back in and out? Oh, yep. Okay. Yes.
Okay, so Sharmarke.
Did you email it?
I did, yeah. It's okay.
Is it? Is this the one? Is this
Yeah,
it?
that's it. Thank you, Ahmed. So, my name is Sharmarke Abdullahi, and it seems like there's a bit of a Canadian takeover, so I'm quite proud of all the Canadian folks represented. And of course, for those folks from Toronto, Ottawa is always a little better, so just keep that out there. So my research was looking at the integration experiences of Somali youth on both sides of the Atlantic as part of my master's thesis paper. And then, it's okay, I can, thank you. And then when the calls for paper came out for this research, I was really fascinated about kind of maybe seeing if the comparisons, or doing a bit of a comparative study and looking at the experiences of Somali youth, their integration experiences in Ottawa. So I based the same research questions that I asked the same youth in London to youth in Ottawa a couple of years later. So I'll get into my presentation agenda real quick. I'll try to stick to the time. I know 15 minutes is so hard to present something that you've been thinking about for a long time. I'll go through a quick introduction and then quickly highlight the Somali migration to London and Ottawa, speak about my methodology, we'll get into a discussion, and then one of the most fascinating things for me throughout this research were themes that came out as part of our discussion, same themes, for youth on both sides of the Atlantic 4 years apart. So I'll get into the first slide here, kind of the genesis of the research. In many contemporary Western societies, debates of how best to integrate immigrant minorities have intensified of late. This has given rise to heated debates about the virtues and drawbacks of such intermingling. This research paper addresses one of the key tenets of multiculturalism, integration. To be specific, I explored the integration experiences of Somali youth in London and Somali youth in Ottawa using the capabilities approach. This is because the degrees to which immigrants integrate into a wider society highly depends on their ability to access education and their ability to also access the labor market in their new adopted homes. The first stream of integration refers to academic integration. How are Somali youth on both sides of the Atlantic kind of performing academically? So I looked at some hard data. This line of inquiry, really highlighted whether youth or Somali youth were falling through the cracks of the education system, leading to social isolation, or whether they were excelling academically. The next, kind of research area that I explored was how youth were, integrating into the economic fabric of their respective adopted home. This section also shed light on the unemployment rate among Somali youth, both in Ottawa and in London. And finally, I took a look at some policy recommendations for politicians, local governments, and social service agencies. Now, it's important to look at how I grounded my research in looking at the definition of integration. And I thought the most, I looked at a lot of literature kind of defining integration, and the one that was most appealing to me was, how Rahma Burns-McCowan defined integration. Looking at integration kind of involving two interconnected parts. The first part being internal and external, which kind of, the first part, internal, involves an individual leaving of beliefs set required in the birth country or paternal household with that of the adopted home, and ongoing renegotiation of identity and reevaluation of beliefs, attitudes, perspectives on every aspect, from food, clothing, to friendship and religion. The second part, external integration, involves the willingness of the adopted home to open up and promote participation of newcomers in every aspect of civic life. So moving on to Somali migration, one of the interesting things when I was doing my research in London was I had an opportunity to visit the Newtown Art and History Museum. For those of you who've been to Carleton and visited that, that's the oldest Somali settlers in London. And this is a neat picture of Somalis working on British Navy ships, in World War II, and even before World War II, as soon as the Suez Canal opened. So the history of migration to London for Somalis is well over 100 years. And the first wave, the first two waves of Somalis immigrating to England, which is quite fascinating, is Somalis were economic migrants. The third wave of Somalis who immigrated after the Civil War were, migrants, arriving as refugees. So how you're received in a host society when you're an immigrant coming, a refugee coming in versus an economic migrant is completely different. And I thought that was quite neat and fascinating to highlight early on. The next picture I have up here is looking, in Cardiff, the first documented Somali marriage between a Somali man and a white British woman from Cardiff. And the man's name is Mohammed Hassan and Katie Link. It's interesting, this picture was taken in 1924, and their descendants are still living in Cardiff till today. So I had an opportunity to meet some of the family members of this family, which is quite fascinating. The next slide, the Somali migration to Canada is not as deep as it is in England, obviously. Mainly because just the close proximity and to the geographical location of England being close to Britain, being close to Somalia, excuse me, and the connection to the colonial past and looking at the connection of British Somaliland and Britain in that migration early on. So prior to 1980s, there were very little Somali presence in Canada, and a large majority started to arrive as government-assisted refugees in the 1990s, and settled in mainly large urban centers in Ontario, mainly as this was where the government was really settling immigrants as opportunities hopefully to find employment. The second wave arrived as family unification class in the mid to late 1990s. Now, the methodology of my research, as I mentioned earlier, used the capabilities approach, and this study was grounded by using that approach to conceptualize the significance of academic and employment integration of Somali youth in both London and Ottawa. My study design consisted of 40 youth in total, 25 from London and 15 from Ottawa. And again, youth were from diverse backgrounds. And if you look at the next slide, it kind of gives a breakdown. It's really, really small. So, the purpose of this presentation is really to maybe whet your appetite and encourage you to read the paper, because it goes into a little deeper in terms of how hard I worked to make sure that youth were from different backgrounds, different experiences, and different socioeconomic classes as well. Now, as in every research, one limitation that maybe, there are some limitations to my research, but one limitation that I'll highlight is the fact that the interview was conducted 4 years apart. Again, the first research was conducted as part of my research requirements for my master's in 2012, and then I subsequently did the most recent research in 2016 in hopes of being published or getting published, and to present at this conference as well. However, despite the fact that this research was conducted 4 years apart, the sample group in both London and Ottawa give us a good glimpse of the experiences of Somali youth who are intimately involved in the unfolding evolution of their integration in their new adopted homelands, thereby informing policymakers. I'll skip the next slide that looks at the breakdown again of our study participants and really get into our discussion of education. Like other diasporas, the Somali community in London and Ottawa saw education as a great equalizer and an integrator into their new homes. In fact, there's an old Somali proverb or saying, which loosely translated means, without knowledge, there's no light. It is therefore not surprising that most of the participants that I spoke to in the research conclusively agreed that, education, that their hopes for a better future were intimately related to their ability to attain quality education in their new adopted homelands. These were kids who sometimes maybe stopped going to school for a while, but knew that in order for them to really get a meaningful job, they know that they saw education as a great equalizer, as something really, really important, as this quote really articulates the sacrifices made by Somali parents and youth, understanding and recognizing those sacrifices made by parents. So, hopefully that they perform really well and make their parents proud. Now, if you look at the numbers and some of the statistics, some of the hard numbers are certainly not pleasing. When we look at this report, Raising the Achievement of Somali People's Good Practices, Somalis are amongst this is research that was done in 2006, are amongst the lowest performing academically amongst other ethnicities in London at 34%. That's 34% of them completing their GSCs, which is equivalent to graduating from high schools in Canada. Now, education is extremely important, as we noted above, and the capability theorists state that education can be conceptualized as a basic fundamental capability for functioning that empowers individuals to participate effectively and independently in their society, ultimately leading to successful integration. We'll move on to some of the experiences in Ottawa. Now, in Ottawa, the school board, this is one thing that Toronto is better than Ottawa, is they actually keep demographics on the school, the ethnicity and the completion of the successful completion based on ethnicity amongst youth. And in Ottawa, I wasn't able to get this information from the Carleton District School Board. However, there are something called multicultural liaison officers that are in every high school across the city or elementary school in Ottawa. And I spoke to several of the staff, and they also noted some of the challenges that were outlined in that report mentioned above, the raising the achievement of Somali peoples and good practices in London in that school report. And some of the challenges are outlined in this slide here. So I won't read it. I'll move on to my next slide. And looking at employment, 5 minutes, okay, so I'll be really quick. The academic literature on integration certainly underscores the degree to which immigrants integrate into the wider society highly depends on their ability to not only access, but to move vertically within the labor market. And these are some statistics looking at some of the, Somalis having the lowest employment rate of all immigrants in the UK. And this is quite similar when I looked at some of the data in Canada. However, again, the Canadian statistics weren't broken down into ethnicity, so they kind of bulked all the Africans into one. And 21%, in 2001, 21% of all African males were able to work in the labor force. Age 15 to 24 were unemployed, and subsequently, 20% of African females were also unemployed. However, despite these low figures, experiences of Somali youth interviewed in Ottawa were quite different. 60% of the youth interviewed reported working part-time or full-time. And the ones who were not working, the other 40%, also reported volunteering as a means to employment. So the themes that were revealed, I won't get into reading the entire quotes, but there were 4 key themes that were revealed and consistent with the cohort that I spoke to in Ottawa and London. And the first one was racism. So what proved to be evident, again, throughout the facet of this research was that the internal integration process was taking place for youth in Ottawa and London who were university attending. They were starting to weave together their birth and adopted cultures. Here's one quote. I can't explain it, but I feel the racism when I walk into an interview. As you can see, I wear a hijab, and I feel some employers pay more attention to my hijab than my resume and qualifications. So, I won't get into the full quote, but that kind of gives you a gist of the feeling of some of the youth that I spoke to in London. But the last quote I'll read in full because I think it really underscores the wittiness and the smartness of some of our kids to deal with racism. At the end of my grade 9 year, here's another quote. I needed to choose courses for grade 10, so I had to see my guidance counselor. And one of the youth, he asked what I wanted to be, and I told him, I haven't figured it out yet, but I expressed my desire to attend university one day. He told me university was not for my type, and I would do better off attending college because it was much easier. From that day on, my friends and I nicknamed guidance counselors dream killers. So youth interviewed referred to feeling included when they had a teacher in the classroom that looked like them. Some representation where they can see themselves reflected in the classroom. And I have a great quote by a teacher, but again, for the sake of time, I won't read it here. The next theme that was revealed throughout the facet of this research, and it was quite consistent, was the negative stigma associated with living in social housing. For many Somalis fleeing the civil war, social housing was perceived as a safe haven. Many saw it as a stepping stone to establish roots in their new adopted homeland, and others called it a poison benefit. Okay, so I'll be really quick again for the sake of time. I won't read some of the quotes that I got from some of the youth. I'll move on to the third theme that was revealed throughout the facet of this research was the negative portrayals of Somali youth in the media. And a lot of the quotes, if I can synthesize the quotes maybe, a lot of youth talked about the burden of having to respond or answer for anything wrong that's portrayed in the media by Somalis. You know, a lot of them said, you know, I hate having to answer for my whole entire race. And then the frustration of you feeling like, you know, whenever something is done, the reporting of ethnicity. So, you know, in Ottawa, if there's a murder, for example, they won't say, despite the fact that this person is born in Canada, they won't say that a Canadian-born Somali youth, they'll say Somali Canadian or Somali committed X, Y, and Z. So that really frustrated some of the youth that I spoke to. A sense of belonging. Now, this is where maybe I'll spend a little bit of time, move on to my last slide, and I'll end. I promise, Ahmed, I apologize. Sense of belonging was certainly quite different, and the biggest stark difference in the research participants that I spoke to. I'll read the contrasting quote first. It doesn't matter how long I've lived in England, I will always be viewed as Somali, never as British or English. It seems like being English for British is only reserved for whites. Whereas the quote above, and this was something that really blew me away, the youth used the metaphor of Somalia being his mother and Canada being his wife. And how, you know, you're always tied to your mother. You'll never lose your mother, but, you know, you have love for your wife as well. So I thought that was a very interesting metaphor to kind of speak to the multiplicity of identities and not see a contradiction between his Canadian and Somali identity. In the slide here, we know that throughout this research, what was evident is that integration is a two-way process which involves the openness of society to welcome newcomers and to promote participation while renegotiating the identity of newcomers into a wider society. And these are some general kind of policy recommendations. And again, throughout the research, Somali youth on both sides of the Atlantic had similar experiences with respect to, you know, challenges in the education system and also accessing the labor market. And one fascinating suggestion or comment that came from one of the youth that I interviewed was, you know, my peers have sophisticated networks when they graduate from university. We as Somalis don't have those networks to rely upon to gain meaningful employment. So we can get, you know, the primary jobs into a labor market, but in terms of career and navigating career, those are some of the challenges. So the experiences of the youth interviewed and the participants kind of illustrate some of the obstacles Somali youth in Canada and London face. And when it comes to navigating their way through the education system and the labor market, although the issues of youth unemployment is not specific to Somali youth, we've seen here that they face additional barriers and challenges accessing the labor market. So thank you for your time, and I'm sorry for any extra time that
Sorry, is it my turn?
Be aware.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We're just
Yes.
So should I?
Sorry, I have no idea where this went.
Who's this guy?
Anybody a techie?
click on Skype.
Click on Skype, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not Skype. It's
Oh, there
okay.
it is.
Right here.
How?
Yeah, I can't actually move it.
Here, how?
Sorry, guys. This is like a technology I've never used before. Okay, that's okay. Just like
How can I double click here?
yeah, I have. Okay, that's fine. I think we can start and then I'll.
So just tell her to continue from where she was at, and go back over.
Okay, so Shamsa, if you can continue from where you stopped, is what Ahmed's sharing with us, then we can go from there. If anybody's a tech person,
Okay.
Sorry, if you could grab everybody's attention again, we're gonna go into this, back into Shamsa's talk. Whenever you're ready, Shamsa.
Okay. Owl.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, can you guys hear me though?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, let's hope it works. Bismillah. So I'll just continue from where I stopped. In my paper, I provide both historical and contemporary trajectories of how the Somali as an image of a threat was created and how the struggle against it continues to be articulated within the security sphere in Kenyan politics. The defiance of Somalis towards being constituted territorially and politically to the nation state marked the beginning of the misrepresentation of the Somali body in Kenya and its association to a threat, quote unquote. I theorize security identities and the state, not as stable fixed totalities, but as a discourse that is contingent and operating in an open space. I disqualify the necessity of privileged points for any political practice, so that the idea of history or knowledge production for minority groups can be positioned and contested. This form of contestation views any discourse as a partial fixation of meanings that can never be fully fixed, thus opening up the terrain for a struggle over meanings. This epistemological framework allows me the liberty to locate change and agency from which Somalis in Kenya can challenge the dominant regimes of representation that have historically represented them as threats, quote unquote. For the possibility of pluralist politics to emerge, there should exist no necessity or permanence of any hegemonic order. This is because of presence of other discourses or counter-representation, therefore power because of presence of other discourses or therefore power, or hegemony comes to be seen as belonging to no particular group due to its contingency nature. This maxim challenges any form of domination in political practice. My paper criticizes the essentialism inherent in liberal democracy, ideas of statehood and security that conceived the state through the domination of all the other elements that makes a society possible. This ontology of the state, security and power was established on non-political foundation, as it still relies on a mechanistic episteme and primarily a quantum theory interpretation of politics. As a result of the universalization of natural science epistemologies in the early centuries. This schema reduces any explanation of political phenomena to one-dimensionality based on cause and effect relationship. I argue that the continued hegemony of liberal ideas, practices, and institutions can be attributed to the failures of statehood among many postcolonial states that are caught up in its loci of thinking. The globality of Western thought is manifest through the adoption of Western institutional structures of security, its language, logic, and practice by the postcolonial state. Security sensibilities pegged on a hegemonic realist framework continue to shape the postcolonial imagination on what order should look like. In the Kenyan context, securitization emerged once it was accepted that the Somali was a threat, quote unquote, or the other, with a capital O. It becomes important to point how the Somali difference came to be seen as posing a danger to the Kenyan state and how its otherness has been viewed as in an unconstructed, harmful sense. The Kenyan state engagement in securitizing practices is in itself a pursuit for certainty for its own identity in order to subsume or eliminate the many ambivalences posed by the Somali otherness. One of the contradictions I reveal is how, on the one hand, a goal of the Kenyan state has been to secure its society, for example, through its military incursion and eventual occupation into Somalia in 2011 until today, and how its practices of securitization have resulted in further exclusion of Somalis who are its minorities, who intensify the militarization of Somali areas, extrajudicial killings, more policing, more surveillance, illegal arrests, deportations, and so forth. To secure or to enhance security, therefore, indicates a rejection of the Somali subject, who is seen as a threat to Kenya's security. In this case, the presence of the Somali other in capital in security discourses affirms the need for their systemic exclusion. This has justified pursuit of militarization operations against Somalis or engagement in war on terror exercises that have come to be perceived as peaceful wars, quote unquote. The historical disavowal of Somalis in Kenya has fundamentally been a product of discursive and hegemonic practices. I argue that the securitization of territorial spaces occupied by Somalis was undertaken simultaneously with the policing of the Somali body throughout Kenya's history. This disavowal arose out of the encounter with the Somali otherness, quote unquote, and it is based on several markers of difference relating to the distinct Somali language, culture, and religion, and their traditional organized forms of power. The formation of an identity is an act of power requiring an I, or you, or us versus them distinction. The other, quote unquote, presented as an opposition, is an integral part of societal existence. In Kenya, the other has historically been a Somali subject. The discourse of exclusion has been operating with the construction of stereotypes and prejudices about the Somali. Therefore, it eliminates opportunity for dialogue and interaction between the included and the excluded, the represented and the unrepresented. Through securitization, the Kenyan state has failed to favor its own society as a collective identity of people acting according to the principles of inclusion and mutual recognition. The context of war against the other, which essentially in Kenya means the war against the Somali, is implicitly as violent as this act of articulation of differences between us and them.
Shamsa, if I may, Shamsa, do you hear me?
Yes.
If I may interrupt you, please wrap up in the next 3-4 minutes.
Okay, I'll try. This is because it has initiated construction of the contradictive identities of we and they that allows the use of violent measures against Somalis. For example, its adoption of war on terror discourse and practices has resulted in the creation of religious divide in a country that has historically never had the problem of religious intolerance. Therefore, what the Kenyan state essentially is doing is the politicization of security to the point that it becomes the sole referent of the truth about security and insecurity, and about who is to be included and who is to be excluded. Securitization therefore reaffirms the absence of the political in Kenyan context, as it leaves no opportunity for political inclusion. Consequently, intensification of securitization practices of the Kenyan state has made war against the Somali subject a usual part of its everyday life. Accepting antagonism, in conclusion, accepting antagonism, ambivalences, and contradictions as inherent in the formation of any social and the political order maintains the discursive terrain open to resistance and democratic demands, as well as offering the possibility for the contestation of any dominance or claims to objectivity, quote unquote. Somali otherness therefore questions the very existence of a unified Kenya, quote unquote, and negates its effort at subsuming its difference for one collective Kenyan identity, devoid of contradictions. The Somali otherness also poses the limit for this modern postcolonial statehood and continues to challenge its hegemony as a securitized state. In a nutshell, this paper analyzes Somalis in Kenya as a unique case study to point out firstly to the limits of the modern nation state in a postcolonial context. Secondly, it points out to the possibilities of exercising radical democracy in a postcolonial context that allows space for political pluralism. The question I battle with is how to transform multiple differences, that is the many different identities, into mutual recognition, or how to institute political regimes that allows for the expression of political plurality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, go thank you. I just want to say thanks for being part of this very interesting 2 days. My research project is within the broader themes of transitional justice, and we're interested in this because of what has happened in Somalia and thinking through how would Somali society move forward together and heal and put to rest or come to terms with what has happened. There were a couple of other papers that came out of surveys that we have done, and this is one of them. The third one that we're working on. It's looking at, if you will, the connections between tradition and, quote unquote, modernity for the purposes of peace building, and it is assessing support for the hair as a mechanism that would work the Somali hair among Somalis. So it's opinion-based surveys. And this is a paper that I am co-authoring with Rahma Abdulkadir, who is a political science professor at NYU in the Abu Dhabi campus. So thinking through that, as Somalia tries to emerge from years of protracted conflict, the question of feasible transitional justice mechanism for Somalia has been raised in the transitional justice literature. Some studies suggest that the indigenous traditional kin-based hair or customary law would be a useful tool of conflict resolution and peace building. Yet, there have not been many quantitatively large studies that look at public opinion among Somalis regarding the utility of the hair in peace building. So Somalia, as a case study, provides an opportunity to conduct that empirical research and look at the costs and benefits of particular types of justice mechanisms designed to address the human rights violations. So for us, using an original survey data set, the aim of the project was, of this paper, was to assess attitudes of Somalis towards traditional hair as a mechanism for conflict resolution among us. Somalis, to assess attitudes towards the reconciliation of traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution and sort of somewhat modern systems of governance, i.e. democracy. The results of this research suggest that at the individual level, there is significant support for hair as conflict restorative justice tool. However, the results also reveal that democracy is valued instrumentally, i.e. as a system that can be useful in the provision of material means of bringing about peace and justice. So embarking on this study then, and looking at the total collapse of the modern, what you would consider the state institutions in Somalia. Obviously, Somalia is not the only country. There are many African countries have gone through this. But as we have seen large-scale communal violence, human rights abuses, how do societies like the Somali society, emerging from protracted intra-state armed conflict, deal with or address past human rights violations? I think we should note that Somalia is not quite a post-conflict society. The Somali conflict has morphed into different things, and I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet. There are a number of recent scholars and policy makers who highlight the answer to that question to be found in these societies like Somalia's indigenous systems of governance and informal local justice systems. In particular, as a direct result of the civil war over the past 2 decades, Somalia has been a focal point of both international and local peace-building efforts. More purposely, the local peace-building efforts have revealed the centrality of the Somali hair or customary law to not only short-term conflict management strategies, but also to long-term peace-building initiatives in all parts of the country. So that is to say that there are some scholars who have emphasized that the hair might be a key tool in the process of dealing with widespread human rights violations that has taken place in Somalia. So we try to sort of look at these things. So in general, we found that there was some consensus in those who wrote on it, that hair can be viewed as a form of social contract between clan groups that combines accepted traditional common norms and elements of Sharia. The hair has always been, turns out. Bear with me. I'm trying to sort of summarize the paper as I go through some PowerPoint slides as well. So we looked at ways to, and I think earlier on there was, the morning panel talked about theorizing, sort of looking at conventionalizing the head itself, and how do you go about conceptualizing the hair. As I said, the Somali hair or customary law is a social contract consisting of rules, rights, and responsibilities developed between male elders. And I think that the key word here is male elders, to mediate peaceful relations between competing clans and sub-clan groups. So the hair in the Somali context binds men who are iskur hair, right? Men of the same sort of grouping and communal areas. The same hair together and stipulates their communal rights, responsibilities, as well as defines rules of conduct between clans that have social contracts between them. It has been argued also that hair is really localized. There isn't a one uniform hair that applies across the country, but it's a localized communal clan, sub-clan, sort of geographically specific spatial, dealing with issues with raising lands and things like that. So there is that. And its application to collective action sort of has local variations and issues that would raise. I'm going to try and rush through this. And maybe to just quote Sharmarke here, this is to pique your interest so you can read the paper when we try it. It's a work in progress, so we're still trying to edit and re-edit and rewrite these things. Even though it's a localized thing, the Somali hair does have some common features or principles that all Somali clans adhere to and employs as a conflict resolution mechanisms. These principles are comparable to what is known as a compelling law in international law, in that they are viewed by clan members as having an indisputable inclusive traditional precedents. So if you think about the Somali male elders sitting under Acacia tree, well, talking about trying to figure out things, there are ways that they would think through if this thing has happened somewhere else, even though they are dealing with a local issue. The question is, so is this something that we don't know from the oral story sharing, that whether it happened in one corner of the country or not? And if the consensus is this is new, then they are really conscious and take the time to deliberate further, because they are setting a precedent. So they do take that into consideration. So general hair rules, just to touch on, there isn't really, it's not written, we know that. It's unwritten tenets used to address conflict between clans and sub-clans. Basically, it's geared towards security, protection, regulation of daily activities, maintenance of harmony between groups, because conflict is a natural thing that happens. There are three key code of conducts provisions to highlight. There is a code of collective accountability, which refers to joint responsibility and payment of compensation. So if someone's sub-clan kills somebody else's sub-clan, the entire sub-clan, or sometimes even wider than that, hello, that was quick, are responsible. So there is this collective responsibility. But there is also some things that might not be always highlighted, and there are some, codes of conduct in terms of times of war and engagement of war. And I find that fascinating that with urban warfare, all those things kind of went out of the window. One of the most interesting part for me was the notion or the concept of Birmagado. Birmagado, technically, we were not blowing each other up in ammunition that we didn't even manufacture, but people were fighting with swords and spears. And in that context, when you are engaged in war, you're supposed to save your spear or your metal weapon that you, certain categories of society, where you were supposed to, put your sword to. So Birmagado were immune from attacks, children, women, elderly, sick, weak, guests, people who were guests in the community, religious men, or whatever, poets are included in that as well. People whom you are not supposed to kill or harm in the event that there is war between clans or sub-clans. Well, we know that that has not been maintained in urban setting and kind of warfare in Somali context. So there were attempts to codify the Somali hair, but they didn't really quite succeed to go there. So it's still unwritten patterns of operation that can be observed in everywhere. The other thing that kind of needs to be highlighted in Somalia today with the collapse of the state institutions is the plurality of the legal frameworks that are at play in Somalia. So you've got the traditional hair, however it may vary in communal levels. You've got the penal codes that were based for the government, but you also got Sharia. To the extent that in relatively peaceful places like Somaliland, and people have the option to opt out of the government processes. If two communities are kind of figuring out a dispute or somebody dies, the two groups can come to the government and say, we don't want to go through the court system. We want to go through the hair and go to the elders, or we want to go through Sharia. So people actually choose, and because the governments that are in place today are not that strong, they're like, bless your heart, go figure it out somewhere else and we'll see. But there are some inclusive processes that are taking place. So that is very interesting in today's Somalia context when we're thinking about ways to figure out how to deal with what went down. Okay. So you kind of have to think about implementing the hair, even though it's not really a written pieces. And we talk about also the limitations in the sense of, as I said, hair is deliberated, talked about, came about by male elders. So we know who's excluded from that process. And when you say that there is now a premium value on hair, we need to keep that gender question at the center of how and the many ways women are displaced, even though they would still be able to historically, if you kind of unpack what went down, that they always played a role. It wasn't a prominent role, and it wasn't always acknowledged, acknowledging their contributions. Coming back to this particular study, we have conducted surveys, and we looked at the best transitional mechanism. We can kind of look at the restorative justice aspects of the hair, how to go about it, and what are the opinions. We had surveyed about 1,500 people from across the country, 46% women, 53% men. We tried to sort of use the 18 regional regions of Somalia in 1990, so we had representation from across. The data was collected both inside Somalia and outside mainly in US, Canada, and UAE, where Rahma is located. We have kind of asked people where they reside, so Canada, USA, UAE, Somalia. There was some refugee camp data as well. I'm going to try and run through this. Okay, so the findings really, the prominence of the hair and the value, even though what is interesting is, depending on where people are from and the age group, there might not be a common understanding of what the hair is. Because as soon as you talk to young people, youngish people, I'm looking at people who are younger than my children here, So when you talk to them, people confuse the traditional Somali hair with what was under the scientific socialism, the hair kapoiska. So I was like, no, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about what was, crafted as hair kapoiska, which means the family hair that was under the military dictatorship, but the traditional indigenous color. So not many people are clear on that, mainly urban sort of generations. And then you speak to people who might be in places like the Middle East, older folks who are very clear that how many ways you can use the hair and how applicable it is. So given all that, and particularly given the fact that when you talk about Somali hair, to 0.5, there are a whole lot of social categories that are excluded. So this is male-dominated, male-produced, male-implemented codes of conduct we're talking about that are even not being respected. So that gender aspect and the fact that people who are deemed today in Somalia 0.5 might not qualify for the same as, because the notion of, you kill a man, you pay 100 camel, you kill a woman, you pay 50. Some people don't even come to that equation, and it's both men and women. So there are a lot of problem areas in this. But one resounding finding we've found is people, even if they might have a very limited understanding of it, will say to you, for Somalis to come to terms with what has happened, we need to mix tradition with whatever solution we are going to find. So similar to Sharia, hair is also here to stay. I think it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And I'm sorry if I did not make a coherent presentation. I was trying to sort of synthesize more things. So, that's it.
We have 5 minutes. Especially you guys, because I think we probably need to have more time to get to the reaction to the presentation. I have comments for you guys, but because you two are here, we can talk later on. I won't share them with you now. For Shamsa, I'll make a few comments about Shamsa's paper because she's not here, so that kind of right. First, I think I want to make a quick summary of Shamsa's argument because I think it's a very complicated argument and also a very important argument. And for those of you who can get access to the paper, I really encourage you to read her paper. One of the central arguments in her paper is the link that she makes between building a post-colonial state that encompasses a variety of different ethnic and tribal groups in Kenya, and the stigmatization and representation of Somalis as the other and thus a threat to this imagined post-colonial state is something that's very much intimately linked, right? It's not an accident that the Somali is represented as this danger, as a threat to the Kenyan state, because it's a necessary component of building a common identity that is the post-colonial state, the Kenyan citizen, right? So I think that's a very important argument that she makes. She also links her argument to what's going on right now in terms of the war on terror and how, that again, because since the 1990s, a lot of African states, post-colonial African states, are facing questions about the legitimacy. So one of the things that the war on terror is providing a lot of African states is a sort of another source of legitimacy once more, especially in securitizing. And so the Somali once more is becoming this dangerous other as the Kenyan state, as part of state building in the Kenyan state. Shamsa, I think I would like you to discuss this current moment even further in terms of connecting the stigmatization of the Somalis to the securitization of the Kenyan state. You do a very good job of sort of showing us that history, but I think I would like to see more discussion right now because I think it's not something that's just limited to Kenya, but it's happening all over Africa in terms of securitizing the state and the stigmatization of certain members of the communities as a danger, especially Muslim communities, of course.
Can I tag on? I read Shamsa's paper, and Shamsa, by the way, it's an interesting and a very revealing paper that you have, and you did an amazing job in theorizing about the whole othering process. you make an interesting point when you come to the current and the way Al-Shabaab is framed as this ahistorical sort of entity that came out of nowhere. What I'd like to see in your paper is try to historicize that, try to historicize the fact that the Wagale massacre in Nigeria happened, even though that you kind of build the case in the literature, in the theory. I would like to see you historicizing that and putting it in that post-colonial, colonial history of the whole region. And then coming back to the current today and the Al-Shabaab kind of creature that also is talked about as if it came out of nowhere and in this vacuum it's attacked, and the securitization discourse kind of leaves the entire conversation of what brought this and how did we get here. That was the only comment I had for you. I really enjoyed it.
And I think we're opening up for questions right now. For any of the papers. Yes.
I have a question for Fowsia. Thank you for being here. Could you talk a little bit about legitimacy in the head, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your findings found that most Somalis abroad and domestic found hair to be a legitimate source of gaining peace or peacebuilding. Could you briefly talk about this in the courts and the connection to hair that the Islamic courts have, or kleptocracy in general within the East African context? And then a brief question, an overarching question for both of you. I've been thinking a lot during this conference about the questions that Somali researchers specifically ask, and research for what end result and who gains what at the end of it. Knowledge, not just from knowledge states, but knowledge with motives. If you're taking a conscious effort trying to understand why you're asking the question, could you guys just briefly talk about why you guys ask the questions you ask? Because I think I have my own theories, but I just want some clarification.
I'll take the question. First, I think we all go into studying what we are studying, because personally we're interested in it. For me, in terms of trying to bring back, I think information is information, and it becomes knowledge when you contextualize it, when you put it in a context and make it relevant to the human experience. So some of the thinking for me is taking, we are educated in multiple ways of knowing, the Arabic, the Somali, the English, the, Western-based, Middle Eastern-based, whatever you have. For me, it's sort of taking that and synthesizing that, whether we read it through the religious teachings or whether it's secular teachings, and also looking at people's experiences and making sense and creating knowledge that is relevant is what drives my interests, because you can't, we can just do literature literally all over the place. It's also learning for me because, I'm one brought up at Hammer, didn't know much about hair. So to me, is when I craft these questions and we think through this, how are they working? When you speak saying, I don't want to deal with the government anymore, I want to deal with the elders. And taking all that when the Eurocentric post-colonial state collapsed in Somalia, what sustained Somalia is not really the so-called modern ways of doing things, even though the business community have capitalized on that. I think people went back to their communities and went back to the ways they knew how to make sense and the examples of what has happened in the north, and settling political grievances through traditional ways. It speaks to all the facade and all the gimmick and all the city-states, Eurocentric city-states collapse, to go back to their roots and figure it out. So there is a literature now coming out saying, yeah, hair is important, even though it is not written, it's not codified, it's not applied the same way across the country. Yet you speak to a Somali who's in Canada, you speak to a Somali who's in Abu Dhabi, or one in the Dhabi, in the refugee camp, and they're like, yeah, whatever we need to do moving forward, we need to not just about Western-based notions. We need to bring that back and combine it, because they were honest about how, because of that whole Birligado business and how hair was trampled all over, that it might not be able to resolve or address some of the atrocities that happen. So people will tell you, let's combine things. It's no longer, this doesn't apply to me, city folk, I don't understand hair. They're saying, I don't understand it, but it has some validity in it. So my research is a combination of my own personal interest versus that, and trying to make knowledge relevant.
For me, like I said, I'll quickly maybe give my thoughts in terms of what really interested me. Before going back and doing a master's, I worked in the social services sector. And often policy is informed by certain narratives that policymakers give a certain community. So when you hear notions in the media about the Somali community not integrating well into societies that they've come to, I was curious in terms of kind of investigating what those experiences were like for Somali youth. So that's what really personally drove me, and I thought of whatever experiences I can elaborate on or contribute to the knowledge, and really using theories like civics theory in terms of capabilities. It's certainly kind of tying theory to practical examples, and that's really what drove my interest in the area of integration. For 10 years, we had a prime minister who believed that multiculturalism was this thing that wasn't working anymore. So for me, those were some of the motives behind really looking at. Canada is quite unique. It's got a very unique connection in history to multiculturalism. It's actually in a policy. It's a government policy. And I think it was the Trudeau government introduced it in 1972. So, and the Quebec government as well has their own integration policy, and that's something that I didn't look at in research. But at some point, I hope to. It's quite different than how the rest of the country looks at integration. So personally, within personal drivers that really focused on it more, coming from the public policy world, it was really informing the policymakers and turning whatever knowledge that I picked up into actual policy recommendations, hoping for change. I think someone asked yesterday around, what do you do with the research or ideas that are kind of discussed? And I think the professor said, this is very easy, you need to really be mindful of that. But, in the current job that I have, we work really hard in terms of transferring some of that knowledge. So I hope whatever we get out of this is the knowledge transformation is really, really important in terms of pushing it to the masses for the mainstream. I think we're really fortunate for social media nowadays. We really push your ideas on many different platforms. But that's certainly really, really important in terms of making policy recommendations for knowledge.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and then just combine the questions at the same time.
Oh, yeah. It's just mine is more of a comment to what Fowsia said. You mentioned that hair might be a solution to some of the problems. I would say it is the only solution. Because, like you said, it's very important. I think here in Boston, so not only those in Dubai or elsewhere, but those in Boston. So hair is the only way. And when hair is violated, it's, that issue remains unresolved. Let's say there's fighting going on, somebody runs into a mosque for protection. You go after them and kill them. That issue has not been resolved. That's a big violation of the human being. And at the state level, that is done. Also, the communities that are victims of that have their own Somali way of informing those people how the hair has been violated. I'm reminded of the poet who said that Hadam Bab iyo Barihan Baha Nimbara do Imagili Bidilahan Sobran. So the Muslim power will be informed that they have made a serious violation of the Somali hair. So I'm glad you're writing this. I think that's number 2.
I'm wondering, this is a question for Fowsia. When I was doing research in Somaliland specifically, so this might not apply to the entire territory as a whole, but I found women found really unique ways of negotiating customary law, otherwise known as head, and civil law.
And for them, many of the young women living in their spoke with that felt disenfranchised by customary law felt that at least if they pursued it in civil courts, that they could get their judgments much more readily enforced. And this was usually in the realm of family law, not necessarily to do with violence. Pardon me, domestic violence is there as well, but not necessarily to do with murder or theft or anything like that. Well, I think women are capable of that.
Oh yes, women are not like.
But in the sense that it was women that were championing access and enforcement of civil judgments. So I'm wondering, I mean, did you guys find any other unique and interesting ways that women negotiated spaces, despite the fact that absolutely there were a sizable number of women that do support?
Yeah, and the interesting part about talking to Somalis about these things is how very practically, very quickly they'll tell you certain things we can use the hair, certain things we cannot. And this is men, women. It's not just women saying it. So I would, the examples that came through from particularly elder men where you cannot even mention the word hair when you think about gender-based violence, because we had specific questions about, cellular hair, and it's like, you cannot use the hair because there's so many principles of the hair that got trampled over when it comes to gender-based violence and what has happened, and using rape as a weapon of war. Some people might deny that, but that happened. It wasn't just chaos and criminality rape that has happened. Rape was used as a weapon of war in the Somali context. And when people are thinking about those issues, they will tell you, we need a combination of things. Some of them will tell you, bring the Sharia, so we could really deal with these things through that. Some will say to you, no, we need to combine that with the civil law. So yeah, there was, even though I didn't particularly have a large set of women saying this, mainly because we did a survey and we had people collecting data for us through sort of like statements, agree, disagree type thing. So, but yeah, sure. Women had agency even within the traditional setting, that they would be able to, as men are deliberating, you will hear stories that they had influenced the outcome of that decision, based on if it was a woman's issue that was being sort of raised. Even though they may not formally be in the city, they talk about ways that mothers and grandmothers made sure that those who were sitting in the tree and making the decision knew the dimension, the gender dimension of the outcome. So there's no lack of agency for women negotiating, even through the hair. But we're also, we have a specific set of gender-based sort of hair and gender and justice access for women. And then kind of very problematic, but people acknowledge that. People know the limitations. I hope that answers your question.
All right. Thank you. Speakers.
Okay, so we're going to take a very short coffee break. We have fresh coffee over there, and then reconvene for the last one.
Thanks so much, Shamsa.
All right, ciao. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. It was so nice.
Yeah. Have a good night.
All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Wait, no. How do I do this? No. Continue broadcast because I think she's hung up. So. Okay.